Today we're going to be discovering all the equivalent fractions for 3/4 using all of our fraction strips. So as you can see, we have our fourths fraction strips. There are 4 equal parts which equal 1 whole. Okay, so the fraction we're going to be working with today is 3/4. So the first thing we're going to do is cut off the end to make this 3/4. So what I've done was I folded this behind it because we want to represent 3/4. And this is 1, 2, 3. And then our fourth is back here, but right now we have 3/4. So to first start with, we're going to start with a fairly simple one to see if 1 is equivalent to 3/4. If I have 3/4 and I match it up against our one whole part fraction strip, we can see that there is still some gap left over. So therefore, 3/4 is not equivalent to 1 whole because, as you can see, we would need one more 1/4 part to equal 1 whole. So we can put that in our isn't equivalent pile. Next, we can look at our 1/2. So if we take our 3/4 and line it up to our 1/2, we can see that although it's very close to being equivalent, it's not. It covers up about half of our 1/2. So we would need a half of a 1/4 to become equivalent fractions. So we can now put this in our isn't equivalent pile. Now let's start with one that I think is going to be equivalent. We're going to test it out to see. Okay, so we have our 3/4, and for this part, we're going to cut it out, each piece of our 3/4, because this will help you understand it just a little bit better. So we now have our 1/8 fraction strip. So I'm going to start by putting the 1/4 directly upon there. Trying to figure out a way to hold this to show you this. Although my lining up skills are a little off, you can see that we have 3/4 and we put them on our 8 strips and it perfectly matches up with that line. That's what we want to see, is that it perfectly matches up. So I'm going to flip the camera around so you can also see that we can fit 3 1/4 pieces into a 1/8 strip. So as you can see, we put a 1/4 here, a 1/4 there, and a 1/4 there. And it all equally goes into 1/4. So to now figure out what our equivalent fraction would be, we can look at it and see how many 8ths did we cover up. If we uncover the first one, we see that we covered up 2 8ths. 2 more 8ths would be 4 8ths. And 2 more would be 6. So we now know that an equivalent fraction to 3/4 is 6/8. And we know this because, once again, we can line up our 3/4 parts onto the 1/8. And it fits perfectly inside of it and doesn't cover. It wouldn't be equivalent if it was like this and covered only like 1/2 of our 1/8 piece. So we can now know that an equivalent fraction to 3/4 is 6/8. So we will put this in the equivalent fraction. Now, when I look through my pile, we're going to try to find another equivalent fraction. And the one we're going to prove that is equivalent is the 12ths fraction strip. So for this, all you would need is your 12ths fraction strips and your 3 1/4 pieces. So once again, we're going to line up our 1/4 exactly with the 12 pieces. So as you can see, if we line it up line for line, our first piece covers exactly 3/12. Then we'll continue on to our second piece. Our second piece, once again, covers up 3/12. And then we'll move on to our fourth one and line it up perfectly. And as you can see, 3 1/4 covered up our 12ths perfectly with some left over. So Now we'll look at it again. We'll flip it over so you can see it from a different point of view. You can see that we're going to put 1/4 here and it covers it up perfectly. Another 1/4 here and it covers it up perfectly. And another 1/4 here and it covers it up perfectly. So as you can see, we could fit 3 1/4 into our entire 12 strip. So if we do this, we can see how many 12ths exactly are equal to 3/4. So we have our 1/4, our 2/4, our 3/4 to be our 3/4. Then we can count our 12ths. We have 1/12, 2/12, 3/12, 4/12, 5/12, 6/12, 7/12, 8/12, 9/12. We can now see that 3/4 is equivalent to 9/12. And once again, to figure this out, you can lay your fraction strips on top of them because you want it to cover up equal parts. An example of a not equal part, once again, would be if we put a 1/4 over a 1/6. If you cover it up and line it up, you can see that there's still a tiny bit of the 1/6 that's showing. And you can hold it this way too to see that it doesn't quite cover up the entire 1/6. But when we have a 12th and we can put a 1/4 over it, we see that they match up perfectly. So that is why those are equivalent fractions, and our other fraction strips like 1/6, 1/3, 1/7, etc. are not equivalent.